Well, kia ora, Grace City. It's great to be back with you again. I put this all black shirt on in faith this morning. Now, if you haven't heard the score, I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it was a good choice to wear black, wasn't it? Oh, I've just spoiled it. Sorry. But it's very good to be with you for this series that we are in, Checkmate, that Jonathan introduced for us last week. The knight on the chessboard, if you're familiar at all with the game of chess, the knight is perhaps the most enigmatic figure or piece on a chessboard. It's the most unique. Every other piece on a chessboard moves in a straight line, whether that's forward or sideways or diagonally or at times backwards. Every other piece goes straight except for the knight. Every other piece can move as far as there's another piece, but then they have to stop or capture that piece. Which means every other piece on the chessboard can be blocked or hemmed in, except for the knight. You see, the knight moves in a very unique way. If you're familiar with the game of chess, it moves in an L shape, like a capital L. So it can go 2 paces forward and then either left or right, or 1 pace forward and then 2 spaces left or right, or backwards the same way. And it moves utterly differently than any other piece on the chessboard. And it can also jump people. It can jump the other pieces, which means the knight alone can never be blocked or never be hemmed in the middle of a chessboard. It's an utter unique piece among all of the other pieces on the board. But as enigmatic as it is, as mysterious as it is, as unique as it is, the knight is still actually reasonably insignificant. It's considered a minor piece. As they give out points for how important each piece on a chessboard is, the knight only gets a few points. Because in many ways, it's still an expendable piece, like some others. It's in many ways unremarkable. It's insignificant. And so it's fitting that today, as we continue this series of Checkmate, we come to consider a character in the story of Esther that we want to use to be symbolized by the knight. So we're in this Checkmate series, which is not a sermon series on chess per se. It's actually a walk through this fascinating book in the Old Testament that we know as Esther. But we're using chess as the metaphor for this because rather than walking through the story and just following the plot in the 10 chapters of this narrative, what we're instead doing over these 5 weeks is rather than tracking the plot line, the storyline, we're actually zeroing in on 5 of the different characters that make up the story. So last week, JD introduced the series here and talked about King Xerxes, who's the king on the board. Now in chess, of course, the king is the most important figure on the board. That's who the whole game of chess is all about, checkmating and capturing the king. But in chess, the king, while looking important and powerful, actually has much less power. And it's the same as the king figure in the story of Esther. It's the great Persian emperor, Xerxes I. And as we saw last week, he looks immensely powerful as the story begins, but he's actually got far less power as the story unfolds than we realize. Well, today we're being introduced to the knight, to a character in the story who, just like the chess piece, can't be blocked or hemmed in. His name is Mordecai, and he's an Israeli, a Jewish man who's at the heart of the story. And just like the knight on a chessboard, Mordecai can't be blocked in. He can't be hemmed in. Because the way that the story of Esther unfolds is the great villain of the story, a man named Haman, who JD's going to be back and introduce you to next week. Haman's arch nemesis is Mordecai. And so the story, particularly in the middle chapters of Esther, is this struggle for power between Haman and Mordecai. And Haman is out to get Mordecai. He's trying to trap him on the board and ultimately take him out. But the story of Esther is the story of reversal and God turning the tables so that Mordecai ends up defeating Haman instead. And the question I want us to think about is, as we look at the story of Mordecai, particularly in the early chapters of the narrative of Esther, what we see is a man who, just like this figure, is actually a minor piece on the board. He's not particularly important. He's not that significant or remarkable. And so the question I want us to think about is what do we learn from feeling like an unremarkable, insignificant figure on the chessboard? Because that's most of us, isn't it? Most of us aren't super powerful or super well known or immensely rich. Most of us are ordinary people trying to live out life for God. So what do we learn from this figure in the story, Mordecai, about how to live in a significant way when we may be an insignificant person on the board? So what do we know about Mordecai? Well, as I've said already, Mordecai is a minor piece on the board. That's the first thing we need to understand. He's a minor piece on the board. So he's introduced to us in Esther chapter 2, verse 5. We read, "Now there was in the citadel of Susa, in the capital city of Susa, a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiachin, the king of Judah." So we're given here the genealogy of Mordecai. He's a Jewish man, comes from the tribe of Benjamin, and his great-grandfather was among the people who were taken into captivity about 120 years before the occurrence in the book of Esther, when the Babylonian army conquered Judah. And so what we need to understand as the story begins is that his ethnicity as a Jew is incredibly important to the story. And that's because his arch nemesis Haman is from another nation called the Amalekites, who were mortal enemies of the Jews. So Mordecai's ethnicity as a Jewish man is incredibly important here. But the reality is, as we heard last week, the Persian Empire was this vast thing, stretching from Africa and Europe all the way out to India. Esther 1:1 tells us it was made up of 127 provinces. It was huge, one of the largest empires of the ancient world. And it was a melting pot of cultures and peoples and languages. And the Jewish people were just one small nation and culture within a whole range of ethnicities. So Mordecai then is just this minor figure in the melting pot of the Persian Empire. Later in chapter 2, we're told that he would sit at the gate, the king's gate. And now in the ancient world, the king's gate was the place where judicial cases and legal issues were sorted out. So it's possible that Mordecai might have been had a role as something like a judge, but we're given no indication that he was especially significant in these early chapters. So more likely, he may have been some kind of lawyer or scribe or low-level bureaucrat in the government of Persia. So he's like one little cog in this massive government machine that is running this vast empire. So what we hear is, what we understand as we begin the story, is Mordecai is really a minor piece on the board. He's not that significant. He comes from an ethnic minority. He's most probably some low-level bureaucrat, and he's really just not that important. He's a minor piece. But what I want to suggest today is he's also a murky piece. He's a murky piece in the story. Now, often when we approach the stories of the Bible, I think we come with a Sunday school mentality. Because in Sunday school, when we're telling the kids stories about the Bible, what we tend to do is tell them most of the good bits and leave out most of the bad bits. And so we can get these pictures of these characters in the biblical stories that make them look wonderful and rosy. And the truth is, as you read the Bible as an adult, you suddenly realize that most of the men and women in Scripture are actually failures at times. They're sinful at times. They make dumb choices sometimes. Isn't that helpful? I find that super encouraging. So, and that's the same with Mordecai. On one hand, Mordecai's a really good guy. And as we go through particularly the opening part of the book of Esther, what we find is Mordecai is caring, he's protective, he's patriotic, and he's courageous. He's caring because he has a cousin whose Jewish name is Hadassah, her Babylonian or Persian name is Esther, and his cousin is orphaned at a young age. She loses her parents at a very young age, and Mordecai adopts her and becomes her legal guardian. And so he's this very caring person. And he's very protective of Esther as the story unfolds. So we heard last week that King Xerxes gets rid of his queen in a fit of anger, and he launches this ridiculous and pretty gross Persian version of The Bachelor, where they basically hose up, vacuum up all of these gorgeous young women from all over the empire, force them into the harem of the king, and then he spends a night of sexual debauchery with each of them to decide which of them will become his queen. He's a sick man. But that's the story, and Esther gets sucked up into that and into the harem. And here's what we read about Mordecai in chapter 2, verse 11. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. So you get this picture of this guardian, this man, who is both caring and protective of this young woman in his care. As the story then unfolds, we come to chapter 3, and the villain of the story, Haman, that again JD will bring to us next week, Haman rises to prominence across the Persian Empire. He becomes the prime minister of the entire empire, maybe what we'd call the Grand Vizier. And he's brought up into this place, but he is this Amalekite, so part of the nation that really were Israel's first enemies. So when Israel first came out of the land of Egypt, way back in the book of Exodus, they will be attacked by the Amalekites before they've even made it to Mount Sinai. And the Amalekites and the Israelites are mortal enemies through the story of the Bible. So Haman, the new prime minister, the new grand vizier, is an Amalekite. And so the command of the king Xerxes is everyone is to bow down in respect to the new prime minister. I think Christopher Luxon would probably like that as well. But this is what was happening with Haman. Well, Mordecai refuses. And probably part of that is his patriotism as an Israelite. He's not going to bow and show respect to a hated Amalekite. And then he's also courageous, because what Haman is going to do is he's going to launch an edict against the entire Jewish people and essentially try and enact an early version of the Holocaust and see if he can wipe out the Jewish nation once and for all. And Mordecai will stand against that, and in the great reversal that God's going to do through the second half of the story, Haman will go down, Mordecai will come up, Mordecai will become the prime minister and the grand vizier, and he will issue a counter edict to Haman's one so that the Jewish people can defend themselves. So on one hand, Mordecai's a good guy, that's what I'm saying. Caring, protective, patriotic, courageous. But I also want to suggest that there's a questionable side to his character as well. Because I think Mordecai is also comfortable and compromising and stubborn and vengeful. So let me run through that list real quickly. First of all, I think he's got super comfortable. See, we're given his genealogy, which is deliberately placed in the story as we meet Mordecai to remind us that 120 years before the story of Esther begins, that the Israeli people that had been taken out of their land under God's hand of judgment by the Babylonians. 70 years later, which was the time frame the prophet Jeremiah had given, 70 years later, the Babylonians are defeated by the Persians, by their greatest king, Cyrus the Great. And Cyrus issues an edict that the people of Israel are free to go back to Jerusalem, to rebuild their city, to rebuild their homes, to rebuild the great temple of Yahweh their God. And so we read in the beginning of the book of Ezra, over 40,000 Jewish people made the trek home. Mordecai doesn't, or his family. They remain in Susa. They remain in Persia. And the scripture doesn't say anything about that. It just leaves it there as a stark reality. But it puts a little bit of a question mark over Mordecai. Why hasn't he gone back with many of the other people to the land that God had given them? And then there's another question mark that comes into the story about how Esther gets caught up in the harem. That maybe makes us wonder, was there a little bit of compromise going on here with Mordecai? Because Esther, who's this gorgeous young woman, gets hauled into this horrible system of finding a new queen, and we're not told anything about what Mordecai did or how he felt or how he tried to fight this. And so interestingly enough, through the centuries, many of the Jewish rabbis have actually raised questions about this. So 500 years ago, there was a Jewish rabbi by the name of Abraham Saba, and here's what he writes. He says, "Now when Mordecai heard the king's herald announcing that whoever had a daughter or a sister should bring her to the king to have intercourse with an uncircumcised heathen, Saba says, why did he not risk his life to take her to some deserted place, to hide until the danger would pass? Where was his righteousness? Where was his piety? Where was his valor? And so there's this question. We're just simply not told. The book of Esther doesn't answer many of the questions we have, but it leaves us with these question marks over his character. And then we come to this part where he won't bow down to Haman, who's now the prime minister. And on one hand, you can understand that because of the ancient feuding between the Amalekites and the Israelites, so that it's patriotic. But there's also another way to look at that, and it's just plain stubborn. You know, I'm just not going to bow down. Now, when you come to other parts in the Bible where God's people are commanded to bow down to a statue or an idol and they resist the king, that's a good thing. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel chapter 3 refused to bow down and worship the idol. Fantastic. But King Xerxes is not commanding people to worship Haman. They're simply commanding them to show some respect. And Mordecai doesn't. And again, many scholars raise a question mark. Is Mordecai being patriotic here, or is Mordecai just being stubborn? And then when you come to the end of the book, and he's now the prime minister, and he issues this great counter edict so that the people of Israel can defend themselves, which is absolutely fair, that they can act in self-defense if they are attacked. The Hebrew text of Esther 8 gets very ambiguous. And so different English translations will translate it differently, but some of them translate the counter edict to say that if the Jewish people get attacked by their enemies, they can not only defend themselves and kill those enemies, they can slaughter the enemies' wives and children and plunder their houses. And you go, wait a minute, self-defense is good, but how far could vengeance go here? And what we end up with, folks, is this understanding of this key hero of the story of Esther called Mordecai, who's undoubtedly, on one hand, a good guy, and he's a hero in the story, but he's a flawed hero. And there's question marks about his character that means he's not quite the Sunday school figure that maybe we might have grown up with. In fact, one of the leading scholars in the book of Esther, Dr. Karen Jobes, here's how she puts it in a very simple way. She writes, the astute reader sees a disquieting moral ambiguity in Mordecai. I love that language, a disquieting moral ambiguity. And the book of Esther leaves the character of both Mordecai and Esther open to be seen in numerous different ways, with question marks over some of what they do. And I think that's fantastic news for you and me. Because what we find in the book of Esther is that God is going to use this minor character with a murky past to play a major role in his story. In fact, that's the key idea, I think, of Mordecai's character. That God even uses a minor piece with a murky past to play a major role in the story. And that's fantastic news, because that's most of us, isn't it? We're minor pieces on the board with mistakes and messes and sin and unwise choices in our lives, and God can still use us. See, the truth of the matter is that the men and women of faith in the Bible aren't perfect. They're all failures. They're all people who make mistakes. So Abraham is the great hero of faith who believes and operates so strongly out of faith, and yet he's got a major problem with lying. King David is the paragon of what a king should be like, from whom Messiah will come, and he's got a major issue with beautiful women. The Apostle Peter becomes one of the great leaders of the early church, one of the key apostles of Jesus, and he's got a horrible problem of foot and mouth, where his foot is often in his mouth and saying dumb things. And the wonder of the story of the Bible is that God uses a Peter, and he uses an Abraham, and he uses a David, and he uses an Esther and a Mordecai. But there's a beautiful book that I have by US pastor Larry Osborne about Peter's instructions in his letter to elders and leaders about being shepherds of God's flock. And writing about Peter, Larry Osborne says, God has a history of drawing straight lines with crooked sticks. I love that. God is a history of drawing straight lines with crooked sticks. Abraham was a crooked stick. Peter was a crooked stick. David and Esther and Mordecai were crooked sticks. And that's fabulous. You know why? Because you're a crooked stick. And so am I. In fact, look at the person next to you. Just say to them, hey, you're a crooked stick. See, this is the wonder, folks. This is the wonder of the grace of God. That God isn't looking for perfect men and women who will operate in faith and play a part in his plan. God is a habit of drawing straight lines with crooked sticks. And he takes people who are minor characters and he takes people who have got murky pasts and he uses us to play significant roles in his story. And that's what happens with Mordecai. As I said, the story of Esther is a story of this great reversal of fortune, where by the end of the story, Mordecai has replaced Haman as the prime minister and the grand vizier of this entire empire, and God uses him to protect his people. But here's what I want to do. I want to come back to Mordecai in the early part of the story, before God reverses that, because God doesn't guarantee that you and I will become prime minister and be the central figures in doing what he's doing. But what we can learn from Mordecai is what should we do when we are insignificant, minor pieces on the board with murky pasts? What can we do to position ourselves to be used by God when we're only minor characters on the board? And I want to suggest 3 things from Mordecai's life in the early parts of Esther. Number 1, do what's right. Really simple. Number 1, do what's right. You see, one of the ways that Mordecai will be positioned so that God can use him later in the story and reverse everything is that in the last part of Esther chapter 2, Mordecai will foil an assassination plot against Xerxes I. So we read in Esther chapter 2 verse 21, during that time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, and Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. It's happened a few times through Xerxes' reign, by the way, and he ultimately was assassinated, but not this time, because in verse 22 we find out Mordecai found out about the plot, and he told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, who giving credit to Mordecai. And this episode is going to be used later on in chapter 6. God's going to use this to begin to turn things upside down. But Mordecai's got no power over that. What Mordecai's got power over is he's just heard these 2 officials, members of the bodyguard probably, plotting to assassinate the king. So what does he do? He could have gone, hey, it's none of my business. He could have gone, oh, I think I may have misheard that. He could have swept it under the rug and just pretended he didn't want to be part of anything. He could have gone, you know what? I don't want to put my head up and say anything because I might become a target of the assassins. He could have gone, you know what? King Xerxes is a disgusting, angry idiot, and maybe this is going to be God's judgment on him. He doesn't do any of that. Instead, Mordecai steps forward and he reports the plot to Esther to tell the king. In other words, Mordecai does the right thing. He steps forward, he reports the plot, and he protects the king. And I think what Mordecai is doing here is acting out exactly what God told his people through the prophet Jeremiah to do as they went into exile. See, famous words in Jeremiah chapter 29. Here's what God says to them as they're heading into exile through Jeremiah. He says, hey, build houses, settle down, plant gardens, eat their produce, marry, have sons and daughters, and increase in number. In other words, I'm sending you into exile for a significant period of time. Settle there. Make it your home. But then Yahweh says this, also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I've carried you into exile. Pray to Yahweh for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Pray for the city. It's part of what the prayer breakfast that's happening in November is all about, being a blessing in this place. See, because the ancestor of the Israelites, Abraham, part of the great covenant God makes with Abraham is that through him the world would be blessed. Part of the call on the nation of Israel as the people of God was to bless the world. So what God was saying through Jeremiah as the people have to go into exile for 70 years for their disobedience was, even in exile you can be a blessing. So Be a blessing. Bless the place where you are. And that's still the call on us as God's people today. Wherever God's planted you, be a blessing. And I think that's what Mordecai is doing. As he reports the plot on this king, he is choosing to be a blessing in the place that God has planted him. He does the right thing. So what do we do? If we feel insignificant and unremarkable and a minor piece on the board, we do the right thing. We choose to be a blessing where God has placed us. That means we serve as model employees. That means that we are the most loving and helpful of friends. That means we contribute to the family that we are part of. That means we are a blessing in the flat that we live in. That means that we would bless others on the university campus. Wherever God has planted us, we do the right thing, we act with kindness, and we bless others to make a difference for Him. So do the right thing. The second thing I think we learn from Mordecai, is to speak words of encouragement. Speak words of encouragement. You see, as the news gets out at the end of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4 about this dastardly plot that Haman has hatched to get rid of the Jewish people, Mordecai ends up putting on sackcloth and ripping his clothes and grieving and mourning over this. But here's the problem. Mordecai can do nothing. He has got no power. He has no voice. He can't do anything to change the edict that has been issued by Haman. The only person who's in a position to do anything at this point is Esther, because she's now become the queen. Remember that? And so Mordecai sends her a message that says, you're going to have to be the one who acts on our behalf and does something and approaches the king about this. And here's what he says, and probably what many scholars believe is the key verse of the entire book of Esther. Esther chapter 4, verse 14. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. In other words, God's always going to protect His chosen people. So if you don't do it, God will raise up someone else to do it. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. And for many scholars, this is the key verse and the key idea of this entire book. Maybe, just maybe, the Grand Master of the chessboard has brought you to this place for such a time as this. Now, let me ask you a question. Who said these dramatic words? Who said that amazing statement that maybe you are right where you are, Esther, for such a time as this? It's Mordecai. These are Mordecai's words of encouragement to Esther. And while Mordecai can't act to do anything to change the situation, he can speak to change the situation, can't he? He can speak words of encouragement. He can speak words that urge her to step forward. He can speak words that exhort her to do the right thing. Encouragement, that very word encouragement, means to put courage into another person through what we say. And that's what Mordecai does here in this key moment in the story. He seizes the opportunity to breathe courage into this young woman, to help her find the courage to do the right thing. And I want to suggest to you that this is one of the most significant things that we can do when we feel like insignificant minor players on the board. When maybe we feel in a place where we can't do anything about a situation, where we can't act, we don't have the power to do something. Often what we do have is the power to speak into the life of someone else who has the power to change. And the gift and the power of words of encouragement is so incredibly important. And I think we undervalue it far too much. God's people are commanded time and again through the pages of Scripture to encourage one another, encourage one another, encourage one another. I love what Christian leadership guru John Maxwell says. He says, encouragement is the oxygen of the soul. And in just the same way that our lungs and our bodies need oxygen to survive, I think in the spiritual world, we actually need encouragement from each other to keep going, don't we? And as I look back on my journey and my life following Jesus, so much of what God has allowed me to do has come because other men and women have spoken into my life words of encouragement. Isn't that true for you? There's so many stories that I've heard through the years of people who've taken a courageous step for God, who've come back to faith in Jesus, who've gone on mission trips, who've spoken up for God in hostile environments, who have stepped into full-time ministry roles, who've taken in a foster child, who have increased their generosity, who have said no to wrongdoing because others have spoken words of encouragement into their lives. And I think one of the great lessons we learn from Mordecai here, folks, is not only does he do the right thing, he speaks words of encouragement. Because sometimes we are not in a position to act, but we are in a position to speak over others. We may not be in a position to act, but we have the power to infuse courage into someone else. So do the right thing and speak words of encouragement. And then finally, I think what Mordecai teaches us in the early chapters of Esther is pray like crazy. Pray like crazy. Because when Esther gets this message, she realizes that Mordecai may not understand that Xerxes is this angry, violent, cruel ruler. And the idea is if you come into the presence of the king uninvited, if he does not immediately raise his scepter and point it to you as an invitation to come into his presence, the bodyguards of Xerxes will hack you to death. And so Esther sends this message to Mordecai in verse 16 of Esther 4. Go, gather all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, day or night, and my attendants will fast as you do. And when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. What a woman. Can't wait for us to unpack her character towards the end of this series. But this is so powerful. Esther says, man, if I go into his presence, he is so cruel and so angry that it could be the end of me, but I'll do it. But would you gather all of the Jewish people in the city of Susa and would you fast for 3 days? Now, in the Jewish world, you didn't just fast. It's a call to prayer. So she's saying, would you fast and pray with all of the Jews in the city, and I will gather my attendants, and we will fast and pray, and we will ask God to do something here in this situation. And now what we miss is the very next verse. We go skipping past verse 17, but here's what it says. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. In other words, for 3 days and 3 nights, Mordecai just prays. What a powerful example when we're a minor, insignificant figure on the board with very little power to change anything, to realize that one of the greatest things we can do is to pound the gates of heaven and the throne of grace. Pray like crazy. Pray like crazy. And that's what Mordecai does. He has no power in this situation. God's going to reverse everything and bring him into a position of power where he can protect God's people. But at this moment in the story, he can do nothing more than these 3 simple things. He does the right thing and acts as a blessing. He speaks words of encouragement to the one person who can do something. And he prays to God like nothing else. And what a fabulous example to you and I of what we are meant to do when we feel insignificant and minor pieces on the board. Do what's right. Speak words of encouragement and pray like crazy. Because what we find in Mordecai's life is that even minor characters with murky pasts can play a major role in what God is doing. Even minor characters with a murky past can play a major role in God's plan. So as we finish this morning, I want to ask you a very simple question. And I'm going to ask if we can just go to the next slide and just leave that up for a couple of minutes if we could. I want to ask you a really simple question. What is God saying to you today? Which of these 3 acts of Mordecai is God just opening up for you today? Are you in a place where God has planted you and his call on your life is simply to do the right thing? In that flat, in that university campus, in that workplace, in that family, just do what's right. Just be a blessing. Or is God calling you this morning to become even more an encourager of others? to change the narrative of New Zealand culture, which is all about discouragement and sarcasm and knocking each other down, and to change that narrative and become a person who speaks words of encouragement over people and to people and infuse others with courage? Or today, do you feel the call of God to pray like crazy and to dedicate yourself even more to taking the situation that you find in front of you where you feel powerless and just begin to soak that even more in prayer? As we finish, I want to simply invite you to bring whichever one of these three is on your heart and just bring that to God. So in the next few seconds, I want to pray for you, but I want to invite you just to pray first. Maybe to have your hands out in surrender to God and just say, God, I sense you're calling me to step into one of these even more. Would you help me as a minor piece on the board to do what I can, to do what's right, to speak words of encouragement, or to pray like crazy so that you can use me in whatever way you wish? I just want to leave you to just come and talk to God about that, and then I'll pray for us. Father, I want to say thank you that in your grace, none of us are actually minor pieces. Because our significance and our impact actually comes from you. And God, we want to just come today and we want to say thank you that you use unimportant people, minor people, insignificant people in your work. And thank you that you use people with a murky past. Thank you that you use us when we've made dumb choices, when we've sinned, when we've turned away from you, when we've been inconsistent. You continue to use us because you're the God who draws straight lines with crooked sticks. And God, we just come to you in this moment of quiet and pray that you would help us to pray more than we've ever prayed before, to speak words of encouragement over one another and other people, and infuse courage into them as they face big challenges. Would you help us, Lord, to do what is right, to just be a blessing, even when we're surrounded by people who oppose us. We long to be used by you to change the narrative in this country. We pray you'd use us as minor, murky pieces for your glory.